Hello, and welcome to Media-eval, a medieval pop culture podcast, where we talk about how medieval and medieval-inspired movies, TV, and books depict the medieval world. What do they get right? What do they get wrong? And what do they tell us about how modern people see the medieval past? I'm Sarah ifft, a medieval historian, and today I'm joined by returning guest Ali Pitts of the podcast Russophiles Unite to talk about Media-eval's first silent film, The Passion of Joan of Arc. Hi, Ali.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you very much for having me back. It's very kind of you.
Thank you very much for coming back, and thank you for encouraging me to do this particular film.
Yeah, it's just one that I'd been aware of for a few years, just as being this kind of like legendary silent film, like one of the most famous ones of the silent era. I finally watched it, I think it was earlier this year, and I was just like, okay, this lives up. Sorry, it's probably spoiler alert for my rating, but this lives up to the hype, and it's medieval. I'm definitely talking to you about this if you'll have me, so here we are.
Yeah, I mean, spoiler alert for my rating as well, but so I watched this for the first time this week, and I often am hesitant to watch silent films. I often tend to assume that they won't be as not good, but won't be as like fun as films with sound. And really enjoyed this and felt like very engaged. So
oh, fantastic! I'm glad that it wasn't me wholly just responding to received opinion of like, this is great, and therefore I will think it is great.
I definitely was suspicious as to whether it was going to be the kind of thing that was like, you can technically see that it is good versus actually something that you find enjoyable, and I think it was both, and so that was definitely a pleasant surprise in some ways.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, how many silent films, roughly, do you think you'd seen before this one?
Very few. Not zero, but very few.
A number that you could potentially count on fingers?
Yes, absolutely.
I am just at the point now where I have run out of digits to count them on. Okay. I think I obsessively use Letterboxd now, and I am doing this kind of silly, eccentric personal project in the interest of trying to be like well-watched as opposed to well-read, where I'm trying to watch 50 films from each decade from the 20s onwards, because I feel like if I do that, I'll have like a kind of good, broad range of like good films that are out there, and probably some not so good films as well. And the 20s is the decade where I have the most work to do, followed by the 30s. So the further you go back, the less I have watched.
Yeah,
but I only really started watching a lot of silent films when I landed on that as a odd personal project. So some of them are a bit of a slog just because pacing and reading title cards. So there you go. But I'm glad this wasn't a chore.
No, and it's actually interesting because, of course, so this is it's a French film, and so you're sort of, the title cards you're actually reading, they're reading the subtitles anyway.
Oh, that's an interesting point then. So were the title cards that you were reading and that were on the copy you watched in French?
Yes, it was French title cards and then English subtitles.
Ah, okay, because the version I watched had Danish title cards because, it's worth mentioning, it's a Danish director, but I think it was shot in France, and I'm going to say certainly the lead actor who's playing Joan is French. I did not do my homework on the supporting cast, but I'm guessing there's a good chance they will be.
At least some of them are French. And so the director, and we'll get into this a little, so the director is Carl Theodor Dreyer, who is, as you said, a Danish director. The project was funded by some kind of French cultural association, I think. And the lead actress, Renée Jean Falconetti, is French. And she's known mostly as a stage actress. And this is, I think, her only film role.
I think I read that somewhere too. And apparently all the stage stuff that she was famous for was light comedy, which is kind of like, okay, casting against type there.
Yeah, it's such an interesting casting choice, and it absolutely works. And I think it's interesting that she's a stage actress because she has such an expressive face.
Oh my goodness.
And she's very good at these kind of like facial movements that The film actually has, I would say, more of the title card dialogue is actually the judges than it is Joan or Jean herself. But because of her face, she actually says so much that she doesn't textually say.
And she has just these big, big eyes. And
yes.
you know the old cliche about the eyes being the window to the soul. Well, these are big windows. These are big, big windows.
Yes. So the only thing that I found a little bit odd is, of course, that they did hire somebody who at the time was 35 to play Joan, who's supposed to be 19.
Yes. I guess it's a tricky one in the sense that you need somebody who has the acting chops and the experience to pull this off, and finding somebody who's of that tender age might be tricky.
Yes, so I think it ultimately works, but when we talk about our own film versions later, I'm going to talk a little bit about casting from that perspective.
Yes, cool.
I also wanted to talk a little bit, before we get into the film itself, to talk a little bit about what I know of the story behind how this film was created, as well as how we have the various versions that we have today.
Yes.
Yeah, so we have this Danish director who makes this film, and it already, I think even before anybody had seen it, was controversial because all of these French nationalists thought it was just absolutely inappropriate that somebody who wasn't French would make a movie about Joan of Arc.
Right. Yeah, and it's interesting in the very opening title cards, it talks about Joan being a woman who died for her country, and at the time, an awful lot of people in France would have known somebody who they would have perceived to have died for their country, because this is, like, the year it comes out is 10 years after the armistice that ends World War One. So,
of course, right.
Yeah, and France lost, I want to say it was upwards of a million soldiers in that conflict. So everyone would know somebody who died in that war.
So very possibly that's heightening some of this discomfort about a non-French person making this story that's perceived as a kind of French nationalist story.
Yes, although I'm sure we can get into some of the nuances and details of that later, or as we go along.
And then once the film came out, it also sparked controversy because it annoyed a whole bunch of other people. The Archbishop of Paris was annoyed because he saw it as being anti-Catholic.
Well, maybe your lot should have thought about that before you burnt her at the stake, but, you don't come out of it looking particularly great.
No, and I mean, okay, the best you could do in terms of making it not anti-Catholic would be to, I don't know, fast forward and add in the bit where they rehabilitated Joan.
Yeah.
But the trial itself sort of is what it is, as I'll talk about more later.
Yeah, very much so. And yeah, my lot apparently super thin-skinned about this thing that we were responsible for, 500 years previously.
Right, but I think in particular they thought the portrayal of the English soldiers, who are these kind of bumbling but evil buffoons.
Yeah.
That they
bumbling
found
evil buffoons
distasteful.
Who are British. That makes me think of somebody, but I can't think who. There you go. Editorializing a bit too much there, but never mind.
Fine. We've got lots of political editorializing on this podcast. But yes, so there were a number of cuts made against Dreyer's will, apparently in particular cutting some bits that were perceived as being particularly anti-Catholic. There was his original cut, and there was another cut that he made that tried to restore some of these things. So basically there were multiple versions floating around, but I think both of his cuts were lost. And then in 1981, rediscovered in the janitor's closet of a mental institution in Oslo?
Yeah, that's what I'd heard. Yeah, this one longer print, surfaces in a psychiatric institution, 2-ish decades after the director's death. So I'd love to know the story as to how it ended up there, but that's the only detail I know, is that it's just oh, look what we found.
Right. And it's fascinating, this story. And I think I must have watched, so the version I watched was 82 minutes.
Okay.
So clearly one of the shorter cuts.
Yeah, sometimes I wonder whether, when you see silent films, sometimes the runtime is just like some versions just play slightly faster. Um,
Yeah.
so I don't know how much of that is just stuff being cut out versus like the speed that it was going at. But yeah, the version I saw was
Right.
96 minutes,
Okay.
but it really flies by,
Yeah.
I found.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a quick film.
Yeah. Because I normally think of a sound era film that's about 90 minutes as being that's a quick film, but my perception of that normally, with if it's a silent film, that changes a lot
Right?
because you've got all these title cards to read.
Yeah, it's a lot of reading.
Yes, and a lot of concentrating on everything that's happening on screen when you can't just rely on your ears some of the time.
Yes. So now we can, I guess, get into the first proper section, the enumeratio or recap of the film, which is just essentially goes through the trial of Joan of Arc. So that's actually one of the things that I think is really interesting about this film, is that it's really exclusively about her trial and execution. It doesn't have any of her, being in battle or leading people or talking to the king. None of that is included in the film. It's just the trial.
Yeah, literally the first time we see her, she's being led into essentially a courtroom.
And it also, I will note, begins, and I love this, with talking about the document. It says that the Library of the Chamber of Deputies in Paris has one of these extraordinary, it describes it as one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of the world, that being the minutes of the trial of Joan of Arc. And we actually have an image of the document, which I will talk about later.
Oh, yeah. That was something I found slightly unnerving, was just how, casual they were with the documents. You just have these hands just, flipping through the documents. I'm like, those are really old. Be careful.
Though I feel like that's what things often tend to be like when you're actually in archives and you're just sort of flipping through. People now recommend against using gloves often because it can actually make you less careful. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Yeah, I remember hearing different schools of thought on that. On the one hand, yeah, it protects the stuff from the stuff on your hands, but on the other hand, yeah, you're less sensitive.
Yeah.
When you've got a layer of stuff between you and the text. But anyway,
right.
Yeah.
I imagine that what was used for the film is probably a facsimile, but...
I certainly hope so.
I can't imagine the archive having actually allowed for them to just film this.
Yeah. But, I've never really spent time working with medieval documents, so my opinion is worth less than nothing, but they look quite convincing. The props department did a good job.
Right. And some of these things, there are really excellently produced facsimiles, although I don't know exactly what that process was like back in 1928 as opposed to more recently.
Yeah.
So who knows? As I said, I'd be surprised if the archive is actually letting them take and film a document, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, some of the stuff that I hear about how kind of cavalier people were with how they treated objects in the past. I went to, this is getting on for 10 years ago now, but an exhibition at the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they were talking about how people were just kind of smoking as they were piecing together these tiny fragments of 2 millennia old parchments. I'm just oh my goodness, people. What are you doing?
As somebody who works regularly, or back in the day used to, before I wasn't allowed to go anywhere. Yes, but back in the day when I worked regularly, in the before times when I worked regularly with medieval documents, the documents that I work with mostly are some of the oldest paper documents in Europe. Some of them is from the kind of mid-13th century.
Yeah, paper as opposed to vellum.
Yes, exactly. So they kind of are crumbling just a little.
Ooh, okay.
As in, you turn the page and there's just, kind of document dust. So just, little teeny tiny pieces of paper from the edge that, fly off and you leave at the end of the day and they're on your clothes and they're on your computer and you're this...
I am walking around with the past all over my shirt.
Yeah, that literally, it's I open up my laptop when I get home and just the, document dust just flies out.
Crazy.
Yeah. It's fun. Well, documents are fun. I'm always glad when they acknowledge that there are documents and sources of movies.
Yeah, I just the idea of it's just so nerve-wracking for me of
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's fun.
Yeah.
I miss it. I'm excited to go back to an archive one day with this pandemic being hopefully sort of almost finally over.
Oh, let's hope so. Anyway.
Fingers crossed. Anyway, the film then gets into the trial itself and has Joan give her name, emphasizes the fact that she doesn't know exactly how old she is, or that it kind of takes her a minute to sort of figure it out.
Yeah, I wondered how realistic that was. It's like, would your parents really not be able to tell you that? But is that reflected in the trial document, or is it just people didn't care about birthdays to the same extent back then?
That, I believe, actually is in the trial document, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's something that you don't necessarily follow that closely. This is an era that is a little bit before parish records are even recording baptisms as carefully and as consistently as they later would. So especially for somebody who's coming from this lower socioeconomic stratum, she's a peasant, it is very possible that they have a kind of approximate knowledge, but that she doesn't know her exact birth date.
Yeah. And it's just notable how sneery the leader of the trial, it's Pierre Cochon. Yeah. And I don't know who the other guy he's talking, but they just give each other this knowing look and are just what a rube.
Yeah, and the thing that's emphasized even already in the title cards very quickly, and then is very clear as you're watching the film throughout, is the fact that it's these adult, all-male, very, very highly educated, in many cases very powerful clergymen and theologians. And that they are experts in doing this sort of thing, that they know all of the tricks, because there very much are tricks for getting people who are accused of heresy to say what you want them to say, and that she is a 19-year-old peasant girl.
Yeah. Yes, the power is very much all stacked in one area. And she's, at this point, been in prison for many months as well, is that right? Or at least for a while.
Yes, I believe so. Yeah, she's already been in prison for a bit, and there's also been a bit of essentially passing her around, because so she gets captured, and initially the assumption seems to be the English having some kind of ridiculous, treason trial. And that's not what happens. It's an ecclesiastical trial for heresy. And this is actually something that Cochon and some other figures in the church are pushing for, is to be able to do a heresy trial. But there is some amount of back and forth about exactly what she's going to be tried for, and therefore by whom.
Right, and whose jurisdiction this falls under.
Yes.
And I'm guessing part of the motivation for going with the heresy trial is to discredit the king of France, who is the enemy of the English and the Burgundians. So that's kind of this person who you were very closely associated with is a heretic, so what does that say about you?
Right. And discrediting her as well, because they are really hoping to get rid of her without making her a martyr, which obviously they're not successful in. I
was going to say, how did that work out for you guys?
Yeah. But that's the hope, is that they could discredit her so thoroughly that there wouldn't be a martyrdom narrative surrounding her.
Yeah. In terms of examples of things spectacularly backfiring in the whole of world history.
Yep. But it is interesting to think about the fact that somebody was actually thinking about this and trying to figure out what the best optics would be, as opposed to, say, something like the murder of Thomas Becket, where nobody thought for 2 seconds clearly about the very obvious, bad optics of that whole situation.
The PR fallout of, offing the Archbishop of Canterbury in his church.
Slaughtering him over an altar, essentially.
Yeah, that's going to be some serious penance.
Yep. So it's interesting that here at least they thought about it. It just ultimately didn't work, obviously.
Yes, plans of mice and men, etc.
Oh, yes. We go through essentially just a lot of the trial itself. They talk about God and whether God hates the English, and she's pretty smart in her response to this. I thought that she just says, I don't know anything about how God feels about the English. I just know that they're not going to be allowed to stay in France for that much longer.
Yeah. And her answers are like they frustrate her interrogators because then she's not falling into the traps that they're trying to set for her.
In a way that's really impressive because these kinds of lines of questioning and the tactics that they're using for the questioning that they're doing really comes out of the, at this point, rather long, couple hundred years tradition of inquisitorial questioning, which is very much designed to trip up and trap and confuse people who are heretics or who are perceived as being heretics.
Yeah, and to get people to the point where they say a thing that you can go, this contradicts our rule, so we have to kill you because you said this bad thing. And you said it. It's not just us killing you. It's we're killing you because you're terrible and you said this.
Exactly, and that in a lot of these transcripts of inquisitorial trials, you can really see this power imbalance as well, and in particular, the ways in which inquisitors take advantage of the fact that they are, in most cases, much more educated than the people they're questioning.
Yeah, it's really gross.
Yeah, and these are people who don't necessarily know the right answer, theologically speaking.
And they don't know that they're being potentially set up to say something incriminating.
And it's even these kind of awful things where, so sometimes you have these cases where people will say something like, basically, I don't know, I think that the right thing is whatever you say is the right thing. And then the response is, that's exactly what a heretic would say.
Right. Just somebody who is intimidated by being dragged before people who are much more powerful and educated than them, and just, being slightly rabbit in the headlights.
Yeah, and probably have a kind of confused theological background of local folk beliefs and things that their priest told them, which might even be wrong depending on how well-trained their parish priest is. And maybe sometimes a heretical preacher comes to town, and if you're a regular person, how do you necessarily know the difference between the heretical preachers and the Orthodox preachers?
Indeed.
So yes, just a lot of these poor people who, they don't know what they're doing.
Yeah, it's as a depiction of, sort of abuse of power and authority, this film is really powerful.
Yes, but as you were saying, I think it is really interesting because Joan's answers are really smart, that a lot of them she is very careful in her responses and doesn't give them the ammunition that they need.
Yeah.
They do talk about the particular issue of cross-dressing and the fact that she's wearing men's clothing, and even say, well, if we give you women's clothes, will you wear them? To which she's basically like, no?
Well, she essentially says, she almost tacitly acknowledges that she's kind of acting outside of societal norms, but she says, once God's mission for me has finished and is accomplished, I will go back to wearing women's clothes. So it's kind of she's acknowledging the societal taboo against cross-dressing, but she's kind of also saying, I'm doing this because I'm on a special mission from God, and therefore, the normal rules don't apply. I mean, she doesn't say, she doesn't explain it in so many words, but her answer is acknowledges that she's doing something that's outside of the norm, and that she realizes that. So that's kind of interesting as an answer. Yeah,
that it is very much this kind of representation of the fact that she has this particular mission, so she's standing by that, but she's also not... She at no point is claiming that she, is planning on, living as a man, which she's not even doing when she's wearing men's clothing. She just, this is what she's supposed to do. God told her to do this while she's on this mission, and then she will return to the status quo of wearing normal women's clothing when her mission has ended.
Yeah, and I listened to some podcasts with Dr. Helen Caster, I think, who's written a book about Joan of Arc, and she pointed out that a lot of especially early on, when Joan was travelling around, part of the reason she would have been dressed in male clothing was to kind of keep a low profile in terms of not falling prey to men who might want to essentially sexually assault her for being a lone, vulnerable woman surrounded by men. So it's kind of she's wearing male clothing partly for her own safety.
And some people have even pointed out that just structurally, men's clothing actually gives more protection from rape.
Yeah.
Just in terms of, like, coverage.
Yeah. Sounds gross to say logistically, but...
Yeah. But there is a logistics to it. And in general, I will say, you know, the whole thing is really very practical, right? It allows her to keep this low profile in various ways, avoid sexual assault. And also, when you're on a battlefield and might have to move or run at some point, even though, you know, she's mostly leading and not necessarily in active combat per se, but that still, you want to kind of move around, and women's clothing isn't really designed for that.
No, it's not particularly designed for, like, the sorts of thing you'll be doing in battle, like sprinting and not tripping.
Exactly.
Not tripping over your skirts.
Yeah, that's just not what women's clothing is intended for.
No.
So, yes, it's really very practical. We have a lot of kind of sinister whispering from the judges. We do have one who says that he thinks she's a saint and prostrates himself before her, to which the others are not super pleased about.
Yeah, they're like, get with the program, man.
Yeah. They also even attempt to trick her so they can get a confession. And I will note now that the emphasis on confessions is really important, because it is actually considered to be the case that it's almost impossible to actually judge somebody guilty, especially in a heresy trial, without having a confession from them.
Yeah, even though this is totally, like, the trial is not done in good faith. Like, they are trying to get her to say these things, but the rules are they have to say the thing that is bad in order for you to be able to move to the next level, by which I mean execute the person for heresy. Like,
right.
You need to get them to say the thing that you want them to say. I mean, maybe I'm being naive. I'm sure it didn't always work like that. But yeah, in this case, they seem to be very much like, we want to document this so that, you know, we've crossed the T's and dotted the I's, and, like, what were we supposed to do? Mm-hmm. She incriminated herself.
And that, in a lot of ways, is pretty standard with this sort of trial, is that not that they are what we would consider an acceptable form of justice, but that there is a procedure, and procedure is very closely and carefully followed. So that means, first of all, that it's not that rare that we have this much kind of detailed representation of the minutes and every single question that was asked. Because this case was important, our records are slightly better, and we have multiple documents, multiple copies of the minutes, and we actually have the verdict, which sometimes they just don't actually include. They just, like, forget to include the verdict sometimes.
Wow. Priorities.
Right. But it's not uncommon that, you know, because there is this procedural concern, we do have a lot of the records of what kinds of questions were asked, how a person was pressured in some cases by torture into giving a confession. And it is also, as I said, pretty consistent that they won't punish you without the confession. It's just that they're willing to do a lot and take very extreme and horrific, in some cases, measures to get you to confess.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, I don't wish to portray this as being anything resembling a fair trial, but it's just like they have set themselves some rules that they are interested in following, so that they at least kind of can make the argument that a procedure was followed.
Yeah, and I think that's important to think about, as the ways in which, like, procedure and justice are not necessarily equivalent, which is also obviously the case in, you know, current court systems in many ways as well. But yes.
Hey, we followed the forms, so it must have been fair.
Yep. We can ignore the fact that, you know, we have, say, an entirely white jury judging a case involving a person of color. Cough, America, cough.
Well, and just, I mean, in the UK, they, being the Conservatives, like, drastically slashed legal aid a few years ago, limiting, if you're from a less privileged background, one's access to somebody who will actually do a good job of representing you, because, you know, they've got no interest in that. But There you go, editorializing again.
Yes. They end up figuring out a strategy to try and elicit a confession from her through trickery. In particular, that they are going to basically forge a letter with King Charles's signature.
Yes.
I really like that you actually see them very meticulously copying the signature. There's so many documents in this movie. I really like it.
Which is interesting because Joan can't read, but she might be able to recognize Charles's signature on a page. Well, I wondered about that, whether it's more likely to be his seal if we were being pedantic about it.
I think in this period, you'd very possibly have both.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. Because we're getting to the point where the nobility, at least, are actually literate, whereas a few centuries before, basically everyone is except the clergy.
Right, yeah. And so Joan is not literate, but that's certainly, I mean, Charles would have been, and many people, especially men associated with the court, would have been. And actually, at this point, even, I mean, we're not too far out from Christine de Pizan, who is, of course, a, French woman professional writer, essentially. Literacy rates are very much on the rise. So yeah, the idea that a signature could be recognizable, especially if it's very distinctive, that's certainly not outside the realm of possibility. And while it makes sense that somebody like Joan couldn't read, it doesn't not make sense that there would be an expectation that there would be people of even, say, kind of the middle classes who could.
Yeah, and look, here's a document, makes our story sound that bit more plausible.
Yeah. Joan also, when she's in her cell, she has this interesting little, twine crown thing that she's made. She's kind of playing with that. She also sees a kind of little cross mark on the wall of her cell created by basically the shadow coming from the bars.
Yeah, and that seems to, we just see a reaction from her that seems like that encourages her, strengthens her confidence to carry on.
Yes. We have our buffoonish evil English guards who come in and they kind of rip the ring off her finger.
Oh, yeah, that's really hard to watch.
Yeah, the way they twist her hand is just very disturbing. Ugh. Then there's this one priest, and I don't actually remember which one this is supposed to be of the many people involved in Joan's trial, but he basically comes in with this forged letter. He claims that he has compassion for her and then shows her the letter and then just reads it. So again, they really could have brought in pretty much anything because she doesn't know how to read, but they did go through the trouble of forging this letter that they have the king's signature on. He tells her that the king is about to march on Rouen and then says, "Oh, this priest that I've sent him to you, and he's really trustworthy."
Because of course he is.
Of course. Poor Joan does seem to fall for that, because in the next segment of the trial, there's a lot of him sort of nodding encouragingly at her, and so she's now a bit more forthcoming in her answers.
Yeah, Dr. Helen Castor described the way that these trials would often work as being you'd essentially have a medieval version of good cop, bad cop going on.
Yeah.
Just as that was part of the way that they got to you.
Yeah, so we see that happening, and that she's agrees that she thinks that, God is going to send her to heaven, that she's assured of her salvation, and they comment on the fact that that's a dangerous answer, that the idea of saying that you, based on your personal visions, are assured of your salvation, regardless of what the church has to say, is dangerous.
Yeah, and maybe I'm messing up the chronology here, but there is a point at which one of the clergy says you realize he doesn't say it in so many words, but essentially saying you're turning your back on the church and you'll be totally alone. Mm-hmm. And she says, alone with God. And they're like,
yes,
that's an annoying answer. I mean, again, they don't say that, but they're just like, she's got us again.
And it's interesting, yeah, because they ask, are you in a state of grace? And she sort of nods. And then realizes, oh, that was the wrong answer. Because you don't want to claim that you're in this state of grace and that, nothing that you can do or that the church has to say matters because, that's heresy. So then she kind of corrects with, if I am, may God keep me there. If I am not, may God bestow his grace on me, which is a smart answer.
It's a great answer. She's covering all her bases there. And they're just like, wish she hadn't said that.
Yeah.
And some of the anger that you see from these powerful men that Joan is just essentially not giving them what they want. and making this thing last longer than they want it to. And just some of the vitriolic anger, like it's really well played in the performances, just like the reactions. Like there's this one bit where this rather burly cleric just like starts screaming at her, and he's right next to her, to the point that I couldn't decide whether he deliberately spat on her face or whether it was just like he's so angry that just stuff flies out of his mouth and just lands on her cheek, and it's just like, it's so repulsive.
Yeah, and I mean, just all of the visuals, the way that they emphasize the power disparity is just, I think, absolutely brilliant.
Stunning. Like, so much of it is the camera angles. Like, you often are looking up at these powerful figures and like down on Joan as she's looking up. And it's very elementary stuff, but it works so well. And often just like the focus is held on Joan, whereas often it will kind of like the camera will glide between the court, essentially, like as they're confirming and exchanging glances, and it just kind of gives this sort of like conspiratorial feel to it. It's very effective. Like, anyone who has any illusions about like somehow, because it's a nearly 100-year-old film, that the filmmakers weren't sophisticated. It's like, yes, they had much more limited tools at their disposal, but they use it in such smart and effective ways. It's really impressive.
Yeah. And the acting, in a silent film, I mean, acting obviously is in some ways very different, but the acting is excellent. And so we've talked a little bit about Joan already, but I also do want to shout out some of these, the actor playing Pierre Cochon and some of these other judges and theologians, that they really just pull off this like sinister whispering so well.
Just like the casting director, in terms of like, I mean, I don't know who was responsible for the casting, but just the faces. They're just like so cinematic, and just the performances are big compared to like modern performances, but they're not like as cartoonish as some people might associate with films of this age. There's a lot of like just like quite subtle gestures conveying things.
No, I mean, I think it is relatively subtle, but there's just a lot of like, you don't know what they're saying, but you know it's bad.
Yeah, exactly.
And I just think it's so well done.
Yeah, and I just found myself just loathing these guys just for how sinister they were. Although I found it was interesting that you do have, like, as we already kind of mentioned in passing, you do have a few of the clerics who are kind of like, have a somewhat open mind about maybe this person isn't a heretic, and the rest of them are like, that's not what you're here for. We're here to get a result, and you're letting your consciences getting in the way. I mean, no one says any of this stuff. I'm just kind of like reading things into the looks that are exchanged.
Well, and it is interesting. There actually is, I don't remember the names of all of these assorted people, but there was at least one person who after the trial was basically like, this was ridiculous, and I don't think she's a heretic, and I think you were wrong. And then he got bullied into retracting that statement.
So some like really sinister high-level quote-unquote office politics.
Yeah, basically. So it is interesting is because, they're bringing in a lot of people, and I believe it is correct that there is a pretty large panel of judges, and some of them are very overtly biased against her, but some of them aren't, but social pressures are such that they don't really get to make much of a difference.
Yeah, but I think in terms of having that nuance there makes the film, like, despite what the French Catholic Church at the time said, it's not an overtly like straight down the line anti-Catholic film, because it's not portraying absolutely everyone as being completely like devoid of conscience.
I also find the entire idea of this being an anti-Catholic film bizarre, considering that Joan is obviously also Catholic and in fact is a saint.
Although it's worth mentioning, this film was made less than 10 years after she was canonized.
True.
It's kind of weird that it's that recent in terms of like when the film was made.
She was rehabilitated and the heresy conviction was rescinded within about 30 years, maybe? I don't remember the dates offhand. But
20, 25, 30, I think. Yes.
Yeah, but that she was not formally canonized until, I think it's 1920.
Yeah, and it was just kind of like the Catholic Church were like, we don't want to talk about her too much because we kind of killed her.
Right. Well, no, she is formally recognized as a martyr, that she actually even didn't have to have as many miracles recorded because she kind of gets a pass because she is considered a martyr.
Oh,
which is
okay.
interesting because, again, they're the ones who murdered her.
I didn't realize that. I was a bit fuzzy on that aspect of it, of whether she counts, because she certainly views us. At least the way the film depicts it, she views herself as when she realizes she is definitely going to die, that she is going to be a martyr, and they're like, no, you aren't.
Yeah, no, she is formally acknowledged as a martyr ultimately by the Catholic Church. So again, I mean, it's like, I think it's overly simplistic in a lot of ways to call this an anti-Catholic movie. She asks to be allowed to hear Mass, and there are a number of negotiations over the question of whether she gets to hear Mass and take the Eucharist, the body of Christ. She is basically, they're like, well, if you dress as a woman, then you can go to Mass. And she's like, no, though?
And they're like, oh, well, apparently you don't want it that badly after all.
Yeah.
That's very upsetting to her.
Yes. We go back to our buffoonish guards who now they kind of take this twine crown, which they place on her head. It's very Jesus crown of thorns. They also kind of grab this arrow and put it through her shirt so that it looks like, which is kind of referencing like a Saint Sebastian sort of thing.
Yeah, like maybe holding a scepter, like she's a king. Yeah, it definitely has like the vibe of, as you say, the crown of thorns / Jesus having a robe put on him and the Roman soldiers like bowing, like mock bowing down and going, haha, you're a king, haha, except, you're not. Yeah, definitely. I think the identification of Joan with Christ is very on purpose. It just it's too obvious to be an accident.
I imagine this is probably one of the things that the English found particularly unpleasant when they banned this film, was the essentially equation of these English guards with like the persecutors of Christ.
Yeah.
I mean, not wrong necessarily, but...
I mean, they did admire, in our imperial phase, we admired the Romans in a very uncritical way.
There you go.
Imperialism. It's great, isn't it, folks?
Yeah.
No, it's not. Anyway.
They take her to the torture chamber and begin some preparations there. We've got a lot of emphasis on the Catherine's wheel or breaking wheel, which I will discuss later. She comments that even if you tear my soul from my body, I will renounce nothing. And if I do say anything afterward, I'll say you forced it out of me. Which I think is a great line. Yeah.
It's very like, you realize that torture doesn't count. People will say anything if they're in enough pain.
Yeah, and she very much acknowledges this. But so then she faints. They're worried that she's going to just die, which they are not happy about that idea. This would not serve their purposes for her to just die in prison.
Very much we need to get the confession out so we can execute her, and it will be like everything was above board, really twisted, gross way.
Yes. They're trying at this point to keep her from dying. They bleed her. I will say the one effect in this movie that does not particularly hold up is the blood spurting from her is not the most realistic.
It did make me feel super squeamish, though.
There you go. So it accomplished something. So at this point, they do start to set up for Mass, which she is very pleased about, but they then basically hold the letter of abjuration that they've written for her before her. Again, we have a lot of documents in this movie, and say basically, no Eucharist for you unless you sign the document.
Yeah, which is, again, super gross.
It's really interesting the way that they visualize this, and that this even, they really do present this as a form of torture.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, psychological torture of
the withholding of the Eucharist.
Yeah, which, her theological understanding would have been such that it's no, I need to have this to be right with God. And so them using their power over her in this way is just incredibly manipulative and awful.
Yeah. They do really also try to make that hit home for her, saying that, you are refusing the body of Christ, that really they are hammering home the, according to their doctrine, real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist in order to really kind of up that pressure on her.
Yeah, it's psychological torture because she
Yeah.
doesn't believe she's done anything wrong, but they are
Yeah.
punishing her for not like going back on what her conscience is telling her is right.
And she does say at this point that, you're saying I'm sent by the devil, you're the ones who are sent by the devil. And there's this kind of great little bit where she's like, you, and then she pauses and is like, and you. And we kind of get close-ups of a lot of these particularly unpleasant old men.
Just being like, how dare she? It's like, well,
yeah,
you're not coming across as super righteous, to be honest, guys.
Oh no. I find this scene really excellent, and just her facial expressions and the real expression of anguish on her face when she is denied this and when she's calling these people out it's really excellent.
Yeah.
They're really able to create just so much drama and so much suspense in this movie, which is basically taking place with no dialogue in 2 rooms.
And indeed, it suffers from, although it doesn't, and this is a testament to how well they do it, it suffers from Titanic syndrome in that we all know how this story ends.
Yeah.
And yet they still, amp up the tension and the, as you say, the drama of the moment.
Yeah, that they make you feel suspense even though you obviously know exactly what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Which does include, so she is brought out, she actually is forced to watch as they dig her grave, which is of course on unconsecrated ground, and also is I guess previously used.
Well, and she had asked, because she's very ill, will you bury me on consecrated ground, at least? And they don't say anything.
Here we see that it's obviously not on consecrated ground, and they even disturb someone else's skull.
In a very chilling image. We just have half of the screen taken up by this partially earth-covered skull with these maggots wriggling in the eyes.
Yep.
It's just really pouring on the gothic horror of impending death. It's this is going to be you soon.
But also, I think another Christ reference. I mean, really emphasizing, the Golgotha, that this is, that there often is this skull that's depicted at the base of the crucifixion, acknowledging that this is a place where criminals were crucified and then buried directly beneath them. So I think that's a kind of Christ reference as well. And so again, really emphasizing Joan as a Christ figure.
Yeah, and it feels slightly Hamlet-ish in that it's the kind of mortality right in your face.
Well, because that is what we have in the film, is ultimately convincing her to sign the document. She does finally sign in order to save her life. This means that she's no longer excommunicated, but that she's, still going to be subject to life imprisonment with the bread of sorrow and the water of affliction. So
thanks guys, rubbing it in.
Of course, also that one of the clergy praises her for having saved her soul as well as her life, but you can already even really tell in her facial expression that she doesn't feel so much like her soul has been saved.
No, quite the opposite.
We again introduce a lot of drama in the gradual process, which will, of course, end in her ultimately recanting her confession. That we go back and forth between her hair being shorn. For some reason, there's a lot of emphasis on, hair being shorn in films about the medieval and early modern world. We see these fools capering outside. There's a lot of professional contortionists that they seem to have grabbed for this one scene of this movie.
Yeah, it's this kind of weird juxtaposition of her at her lowest ebb. We've seen her through all this anguish, but the moment after she's signed this confession that was forced out of her, she's really in anguish. And then you just have these people capering in a funny way. It's kind of that's a weird juxtaposition.
Yeah, so you have the people capering, and then we have Joan, and we have Joan's face, and we have this close-up on the broom sweeping away her hair and her little twine crown thing. That's basically when it sort of hits her. She asks for the judges to be called back and says that she lies, that she only confessed because she was afraid of being burned at the stake, and that she takes it back.
Yeah. And they're like, you realize what this means? And she's like, yes.
Yep. The priest has come to prepare her for death, and I have never been so happy to have watched that, to watch somebody be able to take the Eucharist. I was saying, it's just like, good for her. Good for you, Joan.
Yeah.
I'm really happy for you.
Yeah. It's just, yeah, at least you get some kind of consolation, but oh, goodness me.
Yes, I'm glad she gets that at least. And she also very overtly recasts her previous vision of her being freed as this, that she is asked, what about this promised victory? And she says the promised victory is my martyrdom, and that my freedom is my death.
Yeah. So she's able to make what she believed she was promised still true for her in spite of the circumstances.
Right. And it's a little like true from a certain point of view, but still, she is recasting her death in a way that is making it meaningful to her, and that is, very much in line with Christian martyrdom narratives.
Yeah. Yes. She's not like massively off base from that point of view.
Yeah. And at this point that they are really emphasizing that what is in some ways so disturbing to some of these men about Joan is that she does have this air of sanctity. And I'll talk a little bit more about sanctity and mysticism later.
Yeah, it's not like she's screaming and like cussing them out and calling them all these terrible things in anger over her predicament. She's kind of like accepting it with sorrow, but with like this impressive fortitude, and they'll be well versed in their hagiographical and martyrological narratives. They'll just be like, uh-oh, this is ringing some really uncomfortable bells.
Yes, that she's fitting just perfectly into very traditional models of mysticism and of martyrdom and of sanctity in ways that, are undoubtedly going to make a bunch of people who very much see themselves as pious Christians very uncomfortable.
Yeah. Oh, crap. Are we in the process of wrongly executing a holy person? I hope we're not.
And especially given that, you have these people who clearly are biased against Joan and really care much more about the politics of the situation than anything else, and fundamentally really don't care. But as we said before, you also have a lot of people who just got dragged into this, who are getting increasingly concerned.
Yeah.
She is able to make her kind of final confession to our one, I guess, genuinely nice priest, who's the one who also allowed her to take the Eucharist. We have a sign hung up describing her as a relapsed heretic, apostate, and idolater. This sign is also the one other thing that it's like, this is just like a piece of paper.
Yeah. Just kind of slightly suspend disbelief that it lasts longer than she does in the fire.
She is then brought outside, and we also have a lot of emphasis on the reaction of the surrounding population in the city of Rouen, which is where she's being burned. The guards really have to keep people from rushing forward. Somebody gives her water as she's walking to the stake.
Yeah, we also see... Am I getting this right in the chronology? Or was this before at like the... Well, it wasn't a mock execution because they were going to execute her, but then she recants. But we see a very close-up of a woman nursing a baby. I think it was at this point, but I thought...
I think this is here.
Yeah, I thought that was, an interesting juxtaposition between, like, somebody, like, a very newly born baby versus somebody who is, like, on the cusp of their death. And it's also possibly meant to kind of bring to mind, both in the audience and also for Joan herself, the future that, like, she might have grown up expecting for herself, but now is going to be denied her because of what's happening. But that's a very powerful symbolic moment.
But also something that does tap in again to certain kinds of models of sanctity, because of course this is a period where you would be constantly inundated by images of the Virgin Mary nursing Christ.
Oh, indeed, yeah.
So it's tapping in as well to these same ideas about the Virgin also as this model of sacrifice, that she, nursed this child who would ultimately then die. I think, again, it's kind of linking up as well with these kind of traditional martyrdom narratives and these kind of connections, of course, to Christ himself as well.
Right.
She's kind of given a cross that she's holding for a bit, although this is ultimately pulled out of her hands, and she is put on the stake. I will say also, the effect, I think this is really well done, because they obviously are not able to do the like CGI actually representing like her being on fire in the way that they probably would in a film coming out today.
Yeah.
But that by going back and forth between the crowd and the smoke and her face, I think they do a really effective job of giving the impression of her being burned at the stake without actually having to show that visual.
Yeah, and they still, I don't know whether they used a dummy or, well, I mean, I guess they would have had to have used some kind of dummy, but it does go to, like, a quite convincing human form at some point that is on fire, and I was surprised how unflinching it was in terms of that.
Yeah.
Like, it's partly the black and white and the smoke, but it does look very plausible, and you're not like... this very key moment in the film isn't undermined by going, well, that's a crummy special effect.
No, I mean, it's excellently done in a way that I think really does hold up and is very affecting. And they also have a real kind of,
conveys the horror of what was being done to her, yeah.
We also see the people basically rising up in revolt and being brutally repressed. We also, for some reason, have this one guy who's just running around with a goat, and I'm not sure what that's for. But...
I did not spot that guy. But yeah, it does, like, descend into chaos at the point where she's been burnt, and, very, very violently, like, put, like, this uprising is put down by the soldiers in the castle. It's quite brutal.
Our last close-up is on the piece of paper, which does last longer than Joan.
Yeah.
Our final ending crawl says that the protective flames surrounded Joan's soul as she was taken up to heaven, and that her memory will be honored for all time by the French people. So, yes, we have this very much, I would say, kind of ending emphasis on this sanctity narrative for her as well.
Yeah.
I don't actually know the director's religious affiliation.
No, I don't. I mean, him being Danish at this period, I would guess that he would be Lutheran, but that is, making the assumption that all Danes were the same 100 years ago. It's a bit of a stretch. But this definitely seemed like it was made by somebody with, like, some kind of, like, at least sympathies for the Christian faith, at least in some kind of way, and certainly like very much behind Joan and her position.
Absolutely. So this way we can get into the vera et falso, where I talk about what this film got right and wrong. I will say pleasantly, it got a decent amount right. Hooray!
Yes, a rarity on this.
Exactly.
Show.
First of all, I wanted to talk about her trial minutes, and I did look up where there are 5 copies in total of the minutes of Joan's trial. One is indeed in the Bibliothèque de la Chambre des Députés, manuscript number 1119, if anybody wants to go look it up in the after times. I assume you could, as a researcher, go and look at it. Of the various copies, it is the one that is physically the largest, and also the only one that's on vellum rather than paper.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I think the going theory might be that this is the copy that was actually made for Pierre Cochon.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Yeah. So this guy who's, the Bishop of Beauvais, and who's this, like, very central figure in the film and in Joan's trial in real life as well.
Right.
Just to note also that, all of these minutes are in Latin, and essentially the way this would have worked is that there would have been a notary who's basically responsible for translating as they go.
Okay.
Yeah, that they might have, like, taken some of the notes in French and then translated them into other copies, or that some of them might have been kind of translating on the fly. So that's pretty common, is that almost always what we're seeing are Latin translations of trial proceedings that would have taken place in the vernacular, because obviously Joan wouldn't have understood Latin.
No. Right.
And that's usually the case of people who are accused heretics.
Yeah. I mean, that would have been an even, like, extra level of injustice if they were conducting the trial in Latin.
I mean, she wouldn't have been able to answer any questions.
Yeah, they're just gonna yell at you in Latin and just be like, you refuse to answer, huh?
Yeah.
Yes. No, that didn't happen. But yeah, okay, so none of the actual, like, would it be Middle French? Or late Old French has come down in the documents?
Right. No, that the documents are basically pretty much all of this Latin translation. I haven't looked at the originals. Sometimes in trial records you have kind of bits here and there that are either still in the vernacular or that have words that are essentially just Latinized versions of vernacular words, because sometimes in particular the people who are being interrogated or people who are brought in as witnesses might use words which don't necessarily have an easy Latin translation.
Yeah, which fair enough. If you're trying to do this on the fly, It's just like, oh, we'll get something down.
Yeah, so sometimes you do have these words which are basically just Latinized versions of what are clearly the local vernacular words. But as I said, I have not looked at the original for this particular trial. But I will say, material culture-wise, I couldn't find a picture, but this looked pretty. It looked pretty close. It certainly looked like something that, could be a 15th century vellum set of, like nice copy of trial minutes.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
They did their homework.
The script looked about right to me, both on that and on the other documents that we saw over the course of the film. It looked about the right era.
Okay.
That's like one of my things every now and then, that every now and then I'll look at it and I'm like, that's supposed to be the 13th century, but you're using a 16th century hand. Because the way people wrote is different. There's kind of traditions of the way people write and what their writing looks like that differ based on place and time.
Right, which, makes sense.
Which is, one of the things that you learn. And so, often, as I said, I'll watch something and it's like, this is supposed to be a 13th century book and you're using like a 16th century book hand. But this had actually, it looked 15th century French to me, which is, not an area where I spend a lot of time looking at documents, but I've seen some and it looked about right to me.
Okay, yeah, the only thing I really have to compare it with is like copies of the Magna Carta that I've seen, which are obviously 2 centuries before this, but
yes,
to a lay person, it looks quite similar.
It has similarities, but there are also differences.
I mean, I'm sure. I imagine stuff does change quite a bit in 200 years, but like to the untrained eye.
Yeah, so so to my trained eye, it actually looked like it was 15th as opposed to 13th or 16th centuries. Yeah,
kudos.
Good job. Yeah, I mean, it is, and my guess is actually that, there are things that they actually looked at the original manuscript and that they've actually kind of made copies of things. So, again, good job.
Cool.
The one material culture thing I will note that is not especially well done would be the architecture, but I assume that's just a kind of practical consideration, that it's very kind of sparse and non-distracting.
Yeah, the funny thing was, I read that they actually spent an awful lot of time and effort on the sets and money and resources, but at the same time, the director said that he didn't particularly care about the clothing and the architecture. It was the thing he was bothered about was the text. But yeah, it's kind of funny that they went to all this time and effort on the architecture, and you don't see very many like sweeping vistas. It's mostly quite claustrophobically shot, which adds an awful lot to the atmosphere of the film. But yeah.
Oh, yeah. And when you do see details, and there's one moment where I think you essentially see these kind of crenellations on the exterior of the building, which are kind of a gesture at the Gothic. But at no point do you see, say, the medieval Cathedral of Rouen or anything that actually looks like that.
Yeah, a lot of the stuff looks very Spartan compared to Gothic architecture.
Yeah. I think the set really is. It's interesting that they did spend a lot of time and money on it, because it does really feel essentially like a backdrop with the sense that it's not supposed to distract from the action.
Yes, and the faces.
Yes. And it's all very white, too, in particular.
Yeah, the contrast is very notable.
Yeah, I mean, it's a black and white film, but
sure,
but it's clearly like you can tell that it's just like stark white walls.
Yeah, but it gives this like emphasis on the people's features
in a way that I think, especially perhaps in black and white, that it would have been a really different effect if you'd had as a backdrop actually the site of, say, a Gothic cathedral or like a stained glass window or something.
Yeah, a bit distracting.
Yeah. I will note also that, so in terms of the trial text, there are some things that it does well, but one quick note of something that hit me as a little bit of an off note is that Joan swears to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. This is a phrase that I feel like I just feel is like it just feels very English to, like, Anglo-American to me.
Yeah, it sounds like a very modern formulation.
And I will say I thought it was modern as well. It actually does have origins, it seems, in English common law, but this isn't an English common law trial. This is an ecclesiastical trial, which has its own norms and procedures for oath-taking, and this phrase, in fact, does not, as far as I could tell, appear in the trial transcript, though, as I said, that's based on an English translation. I did not look at the Latin.
Yeah, and my Danish is very limited.
Yeah, and in terms of the translation, everything like goes by relatively quickly in some ways, but I think that is both the translation in the French title cards, and that makes sense, the translation of the French title cards, and is what I saw in the English translation of them.
Sure.
So in the torture chamber, we have this big emphasis on the Catherine wheel or breaking wheel.
Yeah, looking at that, I was kind of like, I don't know how this is supposed to get information out of anybody. Wouldn't this just, straight up kill them straight away?
Yep, so pretty much, yeah, it does. Or it at least, breaks your body beyond recognition. Sometimes it would be a little slow as, the only thing to kill them. So sometimes, you also cut their head off. But the point is, it is actually exclusively an execution method. Nobody's using the breaking wheel just to interrogate somebody.
Yeah, it's not designed to hurt you enough that you'll talk, but not enough that you will die.
They basically did a version of waterboarding, essentially, would be probably the kind of a more common torture method.
Yeah. Oof.
In terms of interrogation. So obviously obviously all disgusting, but It is, I think, to some extent, it's that, the visual of the Catherine wheel is very striking, and so that's what's emphasized because it's a striking visual, but it's not something that would be in a torture chamber and something that as to be used as an interrogation method.
Yeah, and they really linger on it, and you just see the guy, cranking that thing faster and faster till it's just going, at a point where you can't see the spikes anymore, and just okay, yeah. I would definitely find this intimidating.
Yes. One thing that I will note that I liked, however, about the emphasis on the breaking wheel, so it is interchangeably called the breaking wheel and the Catherine wheel, and the reason it's called the Catherine wheel is because it's often associated with Saint Catherine of Alexandria, because she was condemned to be executed on the breaking wheel, and then miraculously she broke it, and instead they just beheaded her.
Not getting away that easily.
God still wanted her to be martyred. He just wanted her to, make a big point about it first, I guess.
About, I could get out of this.
Yeah, exactly. I'm ultimately not going to. Ultimately, I'm down to be martyred for God, but I could.
Yeah.
So it has this association with Catherine, and I do like that as an interesting touch, because Catherine is one of these saints that Joan regularly references as somebody who shows up in her visions.
Yeah, because we don't get very much detail on her visions in this film. They talk a bit about, when St. Michael came to you, was he wearing clothes? Was his hair long? They talk about that, but that's, at least if memory serves, the only bit where they're getting into specifics. And this one kind of very, he kind of has this kind of, sweaty, I guess you'd call it bangs, fringe hair, very large. Priest is was he naked? And it's just and he seems to be very interested in this answer, and she's just do you think God wouldn't have clothes for him?
Right.
And he's just disappointed that she's not yeah, right. super naked. Super naked,
washboard abs, St. Michael, man.
Yeah, he does seem very disappointed by the lack of her saying something salacious.
Right. Such a disappointment. I mean, I'll talk more about mysticism, but there certainly are mystical visions where a naked St. Michael with washboard abs would not have been out of place.
Good to know.
Not Jones, but
right.
Some.
Okay.
But that does then lead into the trial record, and I will say a lot of this film very clearly is taking things pretty closely from the trial record itself, or otherwise feels very true to the text, including the fact that, she's up against, this group, it is 60 judges.
Just, how insanely intimidating to have all of these people just, pointing their intellects at you, and you're a 19-year-old peasant.
Yeah, and I didn't count, but I think the film absolutely represents the effect of this mass of educated older men.
Yeah, like towering over you, like it represents it very physically, but just in a kind of like intimidation kind of way.
And one of the things that I think is also worth noting is that the trial record, as you read it, and this is again a record that is produced by the people who condemned her, is so unsubtly biased that they actually used it at her for her canonization.
Right.
In terms of, again, ultimately declaring her a martyr.
Yeah, wow.
Just martyred by her own church.
Yeah, not their finest hour.
Yeah, the film also emphasizes a couple of real points of contention that appear in the trial records, including her choice to wear men's clothing, which she does very overtly state is God's will, her conviction that she is assured of her salvation, which is obviously something that is a dangerous thing to say from certain perspectives, and these negotiations over whether or not she can hear Mass. All of that is in the trial record.
Okay, yeah, that seemed like stuff just from if you're making a film even nearly 100 years ago that you wouldn't particularly get into if it wasn't based on stuff that was in the text, just because I can't imagine people 100 years ago would be particularly caring about those details. You're not putting those in necessarily for the drama, although they do a great job of like making them important to us as viewers.
Yes. I think they successfully, give a sense of why these questions matter to people who aren't medieval historians.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how I would respond to this film if I didn't know anything about this stuff. Mm-hmm. I think the, relative amount of knowledge I do have about these things, I think definitely enriches the experience and it helps me understand the stakes, but yeah. So it's hard to say how good this would be to somebody coming at it without any of that background.
Yeah, I would be really curious to hear the perspective of how this holds up to people who don't have a lot of knowledge about the medieval period, since the kinds of questions that they're asking, I spent enough time just looking at this material that I can pretty quickly be like, oh, this is the thing they're trying to get her to say, and these are the kinds of concerns that are at work, and these are the discourses that she's engaging in.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd be curious as to what resonance these things have if you don't have that familiarity.
Yeah.
The thing that does get mostly left out, as hinted at before, is the visionary aspect of Joan's mysticism. That, as you said, we have this one conversation about Michael, but we don't have a lot of emphasis on specifically the kind of visions and voices as things that are influential to Joan. And we also do cut out our dear friends Margaret and Catherine, Saints Margaret and Catherine, who appear quite prominently in Joan's visions, including even that when she recants her initial confession, she actually refers really overtly to conversations with the saints in terms of why she's ultimately recanting. She says that God sent her word through Saint Catherine and Saint Margaret, quote, of the great pity of this treason by which she consented to abjure and recant in order to save her life, that she had damned herself to save her life. She said that before Thursday they told her what to do and say then, which she did. And that further the voices told her when she was on the scaffold or platform before the people to answer the priest boldly. And she kind of goes on to basically say, all of these things that I am doing and saying are things that I was very directly told from God or from these saints and in these visions. That is, I think, to some extent left out to emphasize in some ways her internal strength and internal conflict.
Yeah, if you show those things, I guess from the viewer's point of view, possibly removes the sense of conflict and doubt of am I doing the right thing? If it's going well, there they are, she can see them. So
yeah, and I think in modern terms and representation, if it's perceived as something that's, real, that she's being told what to do, it arguably undermines her agency from the perspective of, people in the 20th century watching.
Yeah, I'm only doing it because the saint told me to. Yeah.
Yeah, but it is, I think, in its own context, is really interesting in terms of the fact that she very much always justifies pretty much everything she does as something that is direct orders from God or one of his representatives. That this, in her own context, I think really makes a lot of sense. and is something that to some extent, I mean, you know, obviously their version of it is from her and from the perspective of her enemies is that, well, it's actually the devil who is telling you to do these things. And, you know, he's appearing in these forms that you incorrectly are perceiving as Michael or Margaret or Catherine. But that from her perspective, you know, she very much is saying like, no, it's not me who's just deciding to do things. It's that I am actually, you know, have this mission from God and I am getting constant instructions from these figures of unquestionable orthodoxy.
Yeah, which, again, like, if you show that on screen makes her, like, harder to identify with for an audience. Yeah. I don't know whether that's part of the directorial decision or just, like, whether representing, like, angelic or divine figures with the technology they had available, you know, just wouldn't be convincing, or whether they had any interest in trying to do that at all anyway.
Right. Right.
Because I can see even doing that now could be super hokey and a bit like eye roll inducing. Because you could definitely do it in very cheesy ways.
Yeah, I think it could be really interesting to play with if done well, but it could be very easy to do poorly.
Yeah, I feel like you'd have to exercise a lot of restraint.
Like, I feel like the way I would want to stage it is, like, I wouldn't even necessarily want to actually show the audience Margaret or Catherine, right? Like, I wouldn't want to actually, like, see that. I would want to see basically, like, Joan talking to herself, essentially. Like, that maybe, like, we watch and, like, we hear just Joan's side of a conversation.
Yeah, because it's interesting because, like, from a modern perspective, it would seem like very much make the case of, like, well, she's seeing stuff that isn't there, so she's suffering from some kind of mental affliction, but she's also, like, because she's so consistent, there's not, like, it feels, like, weirdly, like, rational, if that makes sense. Like, yeah. It doesn't just seem like a bunch of random things that she's talking about.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm not a psychologist and don't really know what I'm talking about on this front, but I almost wonder if it's essentially just a way that in this context where people did believe in the possibility of this kind of visionary experience, that it really is just actually a way that you mentally process things and deal with your internal conflicts, is that you perceive them as maybe these conversations that you're having with these holy figures.
Yeah, yes, I definitely think, like, your perception of what is possible will affect, like, your reaction to what's going on in your own head.
And, you know, I think it's important to, on the one hand, acknowledge that, like, yes, you know, as say, you know, if we are a modern secular audience, we don't believe that she actually had saints come down and tell her things, but that she could have perceived things in that way, and it doesn't necessarily map onto what we might diagnose as being a mental illness in a modern context.
Yeah. I think that's a very valid point.
I also wanted to make a couple of notes about Joan's execution, because they include some specific accurate details, including the fact that she is specifically condemned as a relapsed heretic. That's actually a big deal. The punishment is actually almost always harsher if you confess and then recant your confession and relapse into your heresy. I think the emphasis on that is good, even if the piece of paper saying relapsed heretic above her head is a little silly, visually speaking.
Yeah.
And also that there are, you know, members of the clergy who are holding a crucifix before her, and that there is, like, you know, that at some point she was holding a crucifix. I think those are little details that are accurate, that are interesting, that they've incorporated. However, they add in this kind of mass uprising in response, which I don't believe happened.
No, I couldn't find any evidence that happened, but it's...
No.
Yeah, I have mixed feelings on it, but, like, from an audience member point of view, it's quite satisfying in that, like, yes, people are responding to the protagonist's, like, anguish by being, like, angry on her behalf. And it also serves to emphasize, like, the brutality of the system that is executing Joan, in that, like, they're totally down with, like, committing massacres.
Yes.
To people who
and our English guards. Again, reminder that this was banned in England.
Yeah, it seems just weirdly touchy to be like, you're not allowed to portray things that we may or may not have done 400 years ago in a bad light. It's like,
how dare you?
Yeah. I was like, why are you taking it so personally?
Right.
I understand if they're saying, oh yeah, your dad did this.
But yeah, it's like, it's a long time ago.
Your
it's
distant
fine.
ancestors. Yeah. Get over yourselves.
So that's really emphasized, and I do think it's definitely a choice into liberty, but I think it is an interesting one, especially is so in light of the fact that, as I touched on before, they really worked very hard to try and keep her death from inciting, actually, any kind of mass response. First of all, they apparently did very carefully expose her charred corpse.
Yeah, like they partially extinguished the flames to be like, nope, she didn't get out of this. There she is, she's dead.
So that they really emphasized, like, yes, she's dead, so no, somebody running around claiming to be Joan next week is not actually Joan. They do that. But then also, they reburned her body twice and threw her ashes in the river in order to keep people from collecting relics.
Yeah, it's like, that's very deliberate, and yeah, we're not going to give you anywhere that you can venerate, so don't even think about it.
Again, I think it is really interesting in terms of just this question of optics, that this is a moment where they know exactly what kind of resonance Joan can potentially have. They know exactly what kind of elements are kind of important in the cult of the saints. I almost wonder if the emphasis on exposing her charred body is also functioning as a commentary on, that she doesn't have like the incorruptible corpse.
Yes, yeah, because there's such an emphasis on like, hey, we dug them up 100 years after their death and they're incorruptible. Therefore, yeah, in my undergraduate degree, did a lot about Cuthbert and pulling people out of the ground and going, look, their limbs are flexible. Isn't this great? This means they're super holy. I'm like, okay, fine.
I mean, there are saints that you can still go see their incorruptible corpses, which, are, honestly, for how old they are now, they're not in bad shape.
Yeah.
Like if you go and see Catherine of Siena's head in Siena, looks pretty good.
All things considered, yeah.
Yeah, for a 700-ish year old head, 600-ish year old head, 650, I guess at this point. Looks pretty good.
Macabre.
So yes, yeah, well, relics. But as I said, I find it really interesting that they know exactly what they're doing and are very, very deliberately working to keep some kind of cult venerating Joan from arising. Obviously, they're not successful, but I still think that the fact that they are very clearly trying to maneuver around these expectations and possibilities is really fascinating.
Yeah, they were sophisticated people. Like, sophisticated is not meant to be a compliment. It's just like their understanding of this was quite subtle.
That can then lead into the Historia Veritas, where I wanted to talk in particular about Joan in a context of mysticism and heresy, which I'm doing in part because I did do a more kind of straight just discussion of Joan of Arc in my episode on the wishbone representation of Joan of Arc, which I would consider a less overall successful representation of Joan than this one. Joan is really, I think, first and foremost a mystic. That's actually one of the things that I really like about this film, is that it represents her as this mystic and religious figure, as opposed to a lot of other treatments that really focus on Joan as essentially a military figure.
And woman of action in air quotes.
Right. Which she really isn't. I mean, even when she's in battle, she's mostly functioning as a kind of to lead battle and to inspire people, rather than per se, she's not like an all-star combatant.
Yeah.
And so I like that about this film. But I think it's also really important to put Joan into this wider context that women's mysticism is not entirely abnormal. If you're looking at the about 13th to 15th centuries, this is the moment where the number of women with a reputation for sanctity really dramatically increases. This is also the period where the number of women who are canonized as saints really jumps up. There is an even kind of further jump when you think about people who aren't canonized during this period, but who are then canonized later. We have a lot of women saints who are coming from this period. I believe, actually, when you're looking at kind of the gender of saints, there's a sort of gap that most of them are either these martyr saints who are from relatively kind of early period of Christianity, and then there's kind of a bit of a gap, and then you have these mystic saints starting from around the kind of 12th, 13th century.
What do you think accounts for that big uptick, if you like?
It's something that has definitely, I would say, continues to be debated to some extent among scholars. In part, I would say my gut is that it has to do in a lot of ways with the fact that we are seeing a kind of growth of popular religion and growing efforts to create options for popular religiosity. One of the challenges is that you're still in this context in which, formally speaking, Christianity has a relatively limited set of rules for women, including that they're certainly excluded from these positions of power. Also, they're even kind of on the margins of orders that are trying to kind of do something different and orders that are, say, emphasizing voluntary poverty and preaching. They're often a little hesitant about fully incorporating women into those orders. So the Franciscans take a while before they really kind of allow for the possibility of the Order of the Clares. And even then, they're like, well, okay, so you're our sister order, but, like, you don't get to go out and beg like we do, because that's not a thing that women should be doing. And you don't get to go out and preach like we do, because that's not a thing that women should be doing. So there's a lot of kind of popular interest in spirituality, but at the same time, there are these kind of efforts to close off a number of the avenues that are available to women. So I wonder if it's that, for some of these women who are maybe especially into these religious movements that are happening, that in some ways the fact that there aren't a lot of normal avenues for them makes them more prone to kind of taking these in some ways sort of extreme avenues.
And then also, like, finding people in the past or recent past, or even, like, contemporary to kind of go, okay, this person is important to me and an inspiration.
Yeah, and so then, the more this becomes a possibility, the more there are then also new models available for these different kinds of sanctity. It is worth noting that this also includes possibilities for these women to have real power. And so Joan is obviously a pretty good example of this, that she was quite influential on King Charles. But the other, of course, great example is Catherine of Siena, who's, this, like, woman who has a vision where she marries Jesus using his foreskin as a ring. Like, she's weird.
Yeah.
But also arguably convinces Pope Gregory XI to go back to restore the papacy to Rome after a long period of it being in Avignon, which obviously then ends up in the Great Schism. So I guess she caused the Great Schism. But
and this is why they were so keen to keep women out of stuff. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. Yeah, but apparently she obviously said some stuff that was less out there than the... I don't know. It's just like a very strange, the past, it being a foreign country and all that.
Yeah, that just the influence that religion has, right? I mean, the way that people took religion seriously meant that even these figures who, as I said, to us seem like really out there were people at the time who would take those visionary experiences really seriously as something that could represent a reality that they had experienced, and that they had power because of that, essentially.
Yeah.
I also think that in particular, this film is interesting because one of the things that it actually has a lot of emphasis on is particularly this Eucharistic piety. So the fact that she is very, very invested in being able to hear Mass and to consume the Eucharist, the wafer, which is of course believed to be physically transformed into the body of Christ. I wanted to especially emphasize this because Eucharistic mysticism and other forms of mysticism relating to food and to fasting is really a major part of women's mysticism in the 13th to 15th century. And of course, the classic work on this is Carolyn Walker Bynum's Holy Feast and Holy Fast, which I really think everybody should read. I think it is an excellent book. Eucharistic piety included a number of interesting features. One was the attempt to live on the Eucharist alone.
Right. I can see that not being maybe the greatest idea from a nutritional point of view.
No, that's probably why Catherine of Siena died when she was in her 30s.
Gotcha. Yep.
Yeah. Though if you did take it as literally being the body of Christ, then it's like a really early version of like Atkins or keto.
Oh, in the sense of it being all protein?
Just a meat-only diet. Yep. It also includes these weird forms of sensory mysticism in which they have a lot of emphasis on the experience of tasting the Eucharist. So sometimes they describe it as having this indescribable and never experienced otherwise sweetness. Angela Foligno described it as it tasting like just the most amazing meat that she had never experienced otherwise.
So really, really good medium rare steak.
Yep. Also, there were a number of women who had these visions in which Christ or angels actually bypassed the priest and delivered the Eucharist to them directly, something that Joan might have found very convenient at this particular moment in time and unfortunately didn't experience. This last form of Eucharistic devotion, I think, is especially interesting in that it touches on one of the issues with women's mysticism, which is that, well, it's something that does have the potential to undermine the authority of male ecclesiastical elites. And that in part because of that, the line between sanctity and heresy is a thin one and often a quite blurry one.
Yeah, it's a bit of a tightrope.
Yeah, you're really walking a tightrope there. It depends a lot on individual perceptions. This isn't exclusive to women. I mean, an example that I actually use with students a lot is that if you compare the writings of St. Francis of Assisi and of Peter Waldo, one of them gets to found an order and gets to be considered a saint. One of them's considered a heretic. They're saying basically the exact same thing.
Yeah, and my understanding is that when the Franciscans, came on the scene, as it were, a lot of the more established orders and hierarchies within the church were like, I'm not sure we're cool with this whole voluntary poverty thing. It seems suspect. Yeah. And I really don't like it that they're criticizing us for having all this money.
Exactly. That a lot of these kind of new forms of religiosity that, again, the 13th century is where you're really seeing a lot of this, they're interesting because they are really cause for concern in that they often involve criticism of the church or the bypassing of traditional forms of church authority. But at the same time, they're really compelling because one of the other things, of course, that's going on is that you also have increasing concerns about heresy, and in particular the Cathar heresy, which is also a heretical movement which emphasizes voluntary poverty. And that's actually probably the reason the Franciscans did get incorporated into the church and given the status of an official order, is with the idea that they can actually help us combat these heretical movements, that basically we can beat them at their own game by also having these people who are living this apostolic inspired life, who are embracing voluntary poverty, that they can have the charismatic authority that these heretical preachers have.
Yeah, my understanding is that the Cathars were coming at a point of view that, matter itself was evil.
Yes.
Whereas the Franciscans were more like, no, matter's fine, it's just being acquisitive that's bad. And being greedy.
Yeah, so there are real differences that make the Franciscans much more acceptable than a kind of Cathar dualist position. But that, as I said, that they kind of have some of these features that make the Cathars attractive to the population without being necessarily quite as dangerous, and that then, kind of gives them a status, but also very much also, explains why, there's, if you're kind of moving into the 14th century and the rise of the spiritual Franciscans, that, there's essentially a faction of the Franciscans that they're like, ooh, you're going too far toward heresy again. So this is, again, something that is really common with a lot of these women mystics, that when is your claim that you are seeing God and God is telling you what to do and that God is assuring you of his love for you and of your salvation. Maybe even you're having some visions of God or of Jesus that are maybe a little sexy.
A little out there.
There are a number of those. A little out there. Angela Foligno, I love her. She's like, and I climbed into Christ's sepulchre and we were sort of cuddling and I think he is actually naked. And she ultimately, she was actually very recently canonized.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, she'd been beatified, but the canonization had not been formally canonized until relatively recently, I think something like 2016, maybe.
Okay, interesting.
And definitely in the last decade. So that there are these mystics who seem really out there, but who do ultimately get to have the consideration of orthodoxy, who are overall respected, and some of whom are even canonized and designated as saints. But then you also have women. So, for example, the early 14th century French mystic Marguerite Porete. What she's writing and what her visions look like and the experience that she has of God in some ways doesn't seem that different from things that we see in the writing of other women mystics, but that something about the particular circumstances surrounding her means that she got declared a heretic and burned at the stake. And unlike Joan, has not been rehabilitated. Yeah.
Yeah, no one went, oh, actually, we got that one wrong.
Joan, I think, really is this especially fascinating example of this thin line between heresy and mysticism, and that she's the one who got both. That she's the one who got declared a heretic, burned at the stake, but then they're like, oh, never mind about that, and eventually, canonized her. And I think that, as I said, really does highlight, that it's not that clear.
Well, and the fact that she was rehabilitated, or her initial trial was, the verdict was revoked so relatively soon after her death is interesting. Something that, I've drawing a blank on her name, sorry. Dr. Helen Castor mentioned was that within a couple of years of her death, there's records of people in Constantinople, asking somebody from the West. So what happened to that maid who was running around France?
Yeah.
Whatever turned out with her, and the fact that her fame had spread that widely is super interesting.
To some extent, you have to wonder if that's why there is this relatively quick rehabilitation, is because essentially in part of circumstances beyond their control, that despite the efforts taken at the time, her reputation for sanctity wasn't destroyed by her condemnation. It, in fact, arguably only increased. And to some extent, that meant that, the right way to go had to be to embrace her as opposed to standing by this heresy conviction.
Yeah, and the Burgundians and the English, their alliance broke down, and so they didn't end up wiping out the more established French dynasty, which Joan was associated with. So if they'd succeeded in that, then, Joan doesn't get rehabilitated.
Right, exactly. That you have this official support coming from the, resurgent and successful French dynasty. That obviously matters a great deal. So I think at this point we can move into the Fabula Nostra section, where we talk about a film or other piece of media that we might want to see inspired by this one. Would you like to go first?
Sure. I don't have anything super well thought out or detailed, but just in preparation for this episode, I was kind of revising this bit of history, which I knew some stuff about just from my A-levels and, degree. And it's just this hugely tumultuous and fascinating, but just, terribly bloody period. And I just thought this would very much lend itself to a mini-series, just the whole latter part of the 100 Years' War. So I'm slightly straying away from the Joan of Arc storyline. I feel like she would be a character who turns up maybe in season 2. But just it's so interesting, and there's so much dynastic, fighting and betrayals and people going to parley and getting murdered on bridges.
Yeah.
And it's just in terms of it just feels like people who like Game of Thrones would be into this.
The real 15th century.
Yeah. And just the thing that perhaps isn't emphasized in modern understandings of Joan of Arc, it's often portrayed as very much the English versus the French. It's no, actually this is in context of what we would understand as a civil war between one faction of the French and another, and then the English just kind of see an opportunity to maybe do well out of this. So I feel it would be a good miniseries. How about you?
So one of the things that I find interesting about this movie is that it's one of relatively few medieval set films which have the potential to be kind of pretty low-budget movies. Because it's really focused on this internal trial sequence, you don't have showpiece battles. So I actually would be really interested in the possibility of essentially a kind of partial remake of this film by maybe a young and up-and-coming woman filmmaker. I would love to. I don't have any particular person offhand because I honestly don't know that much about up-and-coming directors. But if there are any out there who are listening to this podcast and are inspired, I think that you should make this movie. I think that it would, again, just be a really interesting opportunity also if you could play with some of the kind of elements of Joan's visionary experiences as well. As I said, essentially I'm thinking about this as in part a kind of remake, but if I were to talk about casting for it, I would say in some ways the kind of biggest change I would make, other than the fact that I assume a remake made now would have sound, would be that I would really like to see a younger actress cast as Joan, because while I think Falconetti was absolutely excellent, I do think that there would be a kind of additional pathos to some extent added by having somebody who really could kind of play up Joan's youth.
Yes. Yeah, that's one of the things that you sort of... I don't feel like I had to suspend my disbelief, but I sort of like forgot about that element of the story when I was watching it. I was just kind of compelled, and it didn't bother me that she didn't look like she was 19.
Yeah.
But yeah, that is a very interesting aspect of the story.
Yeah, I think it's, very possible in terms of casting that you should really, find somebody who none of us have as of yet ever heard of. But in terms of people who are around at the moment, Anya Taylor-Joy, I think could be good.
That was the thing. I was thinking, who could you cast? And I kept thinking of like, oh yeah, this person is a young actor who's a woman. And like, oh no, she's 27 at this point. Like, I remember thinking, oh, Saoirse Ronan would be good. Oh yeah, she's nearly 10 years, nearly 10 years out from being 19. So yeah, it just probably goes to show that my finger isn't super on the pulse with upcoming actors. But yeah, that is definitely a big challenge about like who do you cast who has the chops, but also is a plausible 19-year-old woman. Right.
So as I said, Anya Taylor-Joy is my current pick on the ground. So I think she's like 24, 25.
Okay.
So close-ish. Carmen has, I'm sure, very strong feelings as well on this, as she is making known. But that I think she's close to the right age. She also, I think, can play a bit younger than she is. And thinking about her role in the Vivitch, I think that she, in that, did a really interesting job of existing at this kind of odd point between the normal and the supernatural, and that I feel like she could absolutely play excellently like a person having visions that we can't necessarily see.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, because that is an acting skill. Yeah, not the easiest.
Yeah, like I think she could... Yeah, I think she could play compellingly Joan having visions, which I think would be hard.
Yes.
Yeah, because and when I was looking, like, a lot of the other people that I came across who are young actors that I think are good, they're, like, a little just too, like, plucky. Like, I like Chloe Grace Moretz, but I don't think that this is the role for her. I think you want somebody who seems a little, like, otherworldly and weird.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that's the interesting thing about watching a film from nearly 100 years ago, is that it doesn't fall into the trap that I suspect more modern versions of this story would do, of like the whole transplanting a 21st century feminist back into like the 15th century, because maybe Joan of Arc had ideas of like what was possible within what her understanding of what a woman's role in the world was, but it was not going to be the same as what contemporary women would be. And so the fact that this is from that far removed means that it doesn't have that like anachronistic weirdness going on.
Yeah, and I would like to see if a modern film could manage that as well. And I do actually think that, the Vivitch is interesting in that, and that it doesn't have its characters quite, portraying that sort of ideology, but that the film simultaneously does acknowledge the kind of really messed up, like, gender dynamics at work in that context. So.
Yeah, because this film still has that maybe this is just being a contemporary viewer and having that resonance of just, like, powerful men abusing their position to persecute a vulnerable young woman.
And that it's hard to some extent to totally get away from that, and I don't think you should. I think that's absolutely what's at work here, and that I think the film does an excellent job of doing that without having Joan, like, say, like, hey, you're being mean to me because I'm a young woman.
Yeah, which is a little bit too on the nose.
Yes, but that is just oozing from the way the film works.
Yes, yeah.
I will say, this film does not pass the ifft test.
Yeah.
But...
No. On the other hand, its central premise makes it harder. It was always a losing battle. Yeah. Yeah.
I will forgive this film for not passing the ifft test. I don't think there's any reasonable way in which it could.
Yeah. Yes, in this alternate reality, yeah, Joan escapes at the last minute.
You're right.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess the other, like, Fabula Nostra version of this is just seeing some version of Joan's trial that, like, uses the text like this film does, just to do it as a stage play. I could see that being super compelling.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the trial transcript is such that I think you could create either a stage play or a film that really hews very closely to the actual dialogue of the trial transcript, with maybe a few things like trying to kind of modernize the language here and there.
Yeah, and sort of compressing for time and... Yeah.
Well, oh, yeah, I mean, the actual transcript is very, very long, so you obviously wouldn't include everything. But as I said, I think it works, and and this is, again, it's one of the kind of many examples that I have of cases in which I think the real stories are often more interesting than the things that people make up.
Yeah.
That I think this trial, almost word for word, has the drama and has, more drama and more interest than, a number of films that I've seen that just, like, make up things that make no sense in historical context.
Yeah, this'll be exciting.
Right.
Yeah. It's just, even though the reason that we have it is not super comforting, from a point of view of just knowing this story, it's incredible that the documents have come down to us from such a long time ago to give such a vivid picture of somebody who would otherwise, you would not expect to hear from.
Yeah, and I think it is just so fascinating as well that these are documents that, as I said, are obviously created by people who wanted to see Joan go down. And that despite that, she still shines through them as somebody who is committed and passionate and not educated, but clearly relatively intelligent. They actually seem to have recorded things accurately enough that, she's not demonized in this text.
She comes out of it well in spite of their intentions, really to the contrary.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and again, I think it is so fascinating and significant that they used her trial transcript to ultimately prove her sanctity.
And did they use it also in the annulment of the original
I believe
result?
So, that I believe they went back to it, for the retrial.
Okay, so it's not even just, she comes across well to a modern audience, like, essentially contemporary audience could read what she said and go, actually, yeah, maybe. Or she was good, and this was an injustice.
Which, again, like, makes a lot of sense in a lot of ways when you think about the fact that, she is really tapping into, in terms of the way that she's kind of talking about things, she's really is tapping into a lot of models of sanctity in a way that, had a lot of potential, that it's very clear even at the time made some people uneasy because she presented in a lot of ways very classically as a mystic saint.
So, ratings.
Yeah.
Ratings. We kind of spoiled this at the beginning, but...
Yeah, I'm going to give it a 4.5. I know I'm always hesitant to give things a 5. I feel like I need to be harsh. So essentially, I think I'm kind of taking off a half point because I would like a little bit more of a sense of Joan as not just religiously committed, but specifically as a mystic. I think that, maybe a little bit more could have been done with that. But I think this is probably the best portrayal of Joan of Arc I've seen.
Awesome. Cool. Well, I think I'm just going to give it a straight 5 because it just really, holds up. I mean...
Yeah.
I think it helps me that I'd seen a fair few silent films at this point, even though I haven't seen a ton, that I'm more used to, the kind of pace and the way that they work than if this had literally been the first silent film that I saw. I'm not sure I would have been as, this is amazing, but just having sort of adjusted to that helps. But yeah, I just found it really compelling, and it sort of flies by and is very emotionally involving.
I mean, and from just a pure film perspective, I'm not somebody who has seen a lot of silent films, and I obviously have, background in terms of this material, but I don't have a lot of background in terms of the kind of pacing and things like that of silent films. And this constantly held my interest. I think just as a movie, this is excellent and absolutely holds up. And I would really recommend that everybody watch it. It's in the US, it's on HBO Max, at least.
Okay, yeah, I watched it on Mubi in the UK here, but it's like literally got a few more days before it disappears off, so you might have to do some searching around. But it's a very well-renowned film, so there's, you can probably get a very good Blu-ray of this somewhere.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think by the time the episode is released, it will no longer be available to you.
No.
Yes, but if you're US-based, HBO Max.
Okay.
So, are there places where the listeners could find you on the internet?
Sure. So, I am on Twitter at Alistair_Pitts. I also have the account for my podcast, which you mentioned at the beginning, Russophiles Unite. I'm also an occasional contributor to the Media-eval Facebook group. So, I'm fairly easily found. So, yeah, come and say hi.
And if you've enjoyed this podcast, please do join the aforementioned Media-eval Facebook group. But also, most importantly, please subscribe in your preferred podcatcher app and rate and review Media-eval on Apple Podcasts. I will read new 5-star reviews in future episodes. Please also follow the podcast on Twitter at media.evalpod, and you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Sarah ifft. And if you have any questions or suggestions, I'd love to hear from you via email at media.evalpod@gmail.com, where, of course, my producer, Carmen, at least, will be, I'm sure, listening to, reading, and responding to all emails. So thank you, Ali, so much for joining me and for bringing this movie to my attention.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been really fun.
And thank you all for listening to Media-eval. Bye.
Bye.